All right. So today is Monday, December the 12th. You've got 13 more shopping days till Christmas. So time to get out there and just so you know, anything with a Glen works for me. No, just kidding. Sounds like I'm an alcoholic, but no, just teasing. So we're going to go through all the forms we use in a listing today. And this is, when you're in this business as long as I have, this is the key: is understanding listings and getting listings and just knocking it out of the park and getting them closed is the key. So you list to exist, as I call it, and buyers are fun, buyers are okay, but buyers all drive you crazy too. So for the most part, listings are, to me, a little easier, and you're almost guaranteed a paycheck. Most of them will close eventually. So there's times where some things won't close, or sellers have unrealistic expectations. And I just went through that, majority of last year with the multi-million-dollar listing I had on Jefferson, and where my seller just didn't get it. And, and I talked to her, I showed her the comps, and we went over things over and over and over. I even had the attorney reach out to her 3 different times because she was having some financial issues, and he was telling her, you got to drop the price, you got to drop the price, you got to drop the price. And she never did. And she ended up getting foreclosed on.
Ah,
So that is a very tragic ending to what could have been a really good story for a lot of different reasons. But that was unfortunate. And it was very frustrating too from the listing side, especially with, being the broker and the years of experience, and like, here's where it's going to go, and just unrealistic expectations. But normally in those situations, I wouldn't even taken the listing if I would have known how it would have ended. But because I didn't get the whole story up front, that was another problem. So I didn't know that she was in foreclosure. But anyway, those are, one of the rare times when something doesn't close. But like now, I've got a HUD listing that I've had for over 4 months. It took a long time to get under contract because it was appraised at the wrong price. And with HUD, they're very methodical on how they reduce their prices. And it took a while to get it to the number that somebody was started making an offer, and then they finally accepted an offer. So that's a long time for that type of property to be out there. And even when I gave my value, house listed at 211. 211 was the appraiser's opinion of value. At the same time, they tell me to go out and do my thing, and we do what we call BPO, broker price opinion. I came back at 180, so that's significantly different. That's $30,000 at that price point. And I'm thinking, all right, well, maybe I didn't get something right, or maybe maybe I missed something, whatever. But they'll never take my opinion out of the gate. They'll always use the appraiser's opinion of value. So needless to say, it ended up selling for like 150 something. So, but they missed the window of the early, late spring, early summer. So they're always chasing that curve, as I call it, where you're trying to price to what was before, where you need to price with like where you're going to be in a month or 2 months. So we talked about this at the office meeting last week, where and one of the things you got to really do in this business is you got to read and look at appraisals when they come in. When you're working with a buyer and you have those, you need to understand how they work and what are the 3 or 4 major categories that can just blow an appraisal. So anytime you have a discrepancy, you want to make sure to review those and look at those and kind of do a deep dive examination on why did that value come in where it's at? What did they use? How did they make their adjustments? And because it's always, one person's opinion of value. And I got, there's 5 of you on the call. So I could send all 5 of you out to do a BPO on that Warren house. And I guarantee you all come back with a different price. It's just the way we are as human beings, right? We look at things differently. We think things differently. I can look at that house on a scale of 1 to 6. I can say it's a 3. Where Cheryl might look at that house and say, well, maybe it's a 2. Well, that doesn't sound like a lot of difference, but from the appraisal world, that's a lot of difference. And that could be an adjustment of $10,000, $15,000 sometimes. So anyway, those are little tidbits that when the time comes, go ahead and ask questions. Because I would ask, can I see that appraisal from my asset manager? I want to see that appraisal. I want to see where they got their comps, how they pulled the information. And we have every right to do that. So those of you that meet the appraisers at the house, I give you a lot of credit. I think that's going the extra yard. But that's a delicate subject too, because some appraisers, and I've asked them privately, they don't want to see your stuff. They don't want you telling them how to do their job. So there's two ends of the coin there. But you're there to answer questions. You're there to have the information available if they like to use it, but don't think you're going to jam that down somebody's throat, because if they don't want it, they're not going to use it. They're just going to pitch it in the can when they leave. That's what happens. Okay. So anyway, just depends how you want to do your book of business, but it's a good learning process that you should go there. And I would go and I'd meet the appraiser and I'd say, okay, just curious, we got a finished basement here. How's that value going to be affected in the overall house? How much value are you giving to the finished basement? And you're going to be blown away. Most of the time, that's like a $5,000 adjustment, no more than that. And that could be like the most gorgeous basement you've ever seen with, bedrooms, kitchens, full bath, dialed up. There's not a lot of value in a basement, and people think, that if I stuck $50,000 in the basement, then the house is going to be worth $50,000 more. That's not the case. It's a very minor adjustment. And one of the other things that gets adjusted very minorly is the square footage differential. In our realtor brain, we have a per square foot price for an area, right? So if you're in Royal Oak, you're looking at $200 to $300 a square foot in some areas, right? So that's how you think of a house square footage wise. And then if there's a difference, you minus 200 per square foot or 300 per square foot. But the appraiser will only do 1/3 of the value per square foot. So right there, one line item like that can blow your appraisal and it will come up short. So these are ways you look at stuff, and condition and quality are the other. So those are four major categories that could affect a value on an appraisal. So when you're doing a listing, when we talk to the client, it's like we need to look at what the comparables are and try to stay within those parameters. Because if you're trying to raise the bar, and we're not in a raise the bar period right now, that was last year or at the beginning of this year. Now we're in where's the bar going to be in a month? It's going to be lower. Where's the bar going to be in 2 months? It's probably going to be even lower than that. So, the Fed's going to drop another 0.5 point this week. That's going to slow us down even more going into the holiday period, which slows us down even worse. But there's still people looking, there's still people buying. It's not the end of the world, but it's changing how we've done business. And those of you that didn't go through, and none of you on the call, the last recession, it's an eye opener. It's an eye opener how your book of business is going to change and how you need to adapt to the changes, right? So you need to find out more about foreclosures and more about HUD homes and maybe even short sales. These are terms that are going to pop back up. We've been very blessed in the last 5 years. You really didn't have to think about that stuff. You didn't have to do any of that. You're going to need to know more about leases, because people are not going to be able to sell their house for what they bought it for in the last 2 years. Almost guaranteed. They overpaid, they overbid in many cases, and now that house is worth less than it was when they bought it. So, and then you top in, closing costs, commissions, you're looking at another 8% on top of that minus. So yeah, they're going to come up short. And if they come up short, the banks aren't, say, well, that's no problem, we'll just take less money. They don't do that. They make, you're going to have to pay the money somehow. And if you have assets, whether it's 401k, it doesn't matter. All that stuff counts. When the bank will not take a shortcut, they won't take a haircut, less money, unless you're not capable of performing. And they really dig deep to make sure, and what you have to supply when you're considering even to do a short sale will blow you away. So we usually align ourselves in this office. We recommend that you align yourself with an attorney. We have Rick Linnell and his associates that are top in the area for managing short sales. So when you get to that listing, and it might be an opportunity where that house is, geez, it's worth less than what they owe. We're going to have that discussion and how, how we're going to funnel this and how we're going to move your property. Do you have the funds to bring to closing? And that's a painful thing for somebody to do, is to bring money to close their own home, and they're not going to get any money out of the sale. That's never fun. And people say, well, why should I even do a short sale? Well, it's a lot less damaging on your credit than an actual foreclosure or bankruptcy. So these are things that are going to start being a little bit more in your vocabulary. So next month, we're going to do I'll do a HUD foreclosure class next month to kind of give you some ins and outs for that. And then maybe we'll do a quick short sale class too, as maybe part of that, depending on how time runs, or do a separate class on short sales. So, which are daunting. I mean, I hated doing short sales. And I didn't have an affiliation. I was with a different company at the time. We didn't have the affiliation that we have here. And a lot of agents were trying to manage those on their own. And that was, very difficult to do. But anyway, here you're in good hands. We've got the attorney. You hand it off to the attorney and their group, and they take it and they run with it. And they will get it closed as long as the seller's going to participate. The seller has to buy into that. The seller has to be willing to bust their butt and get the attorney what they need. And they're going to ask them for a lot of stuff. It's like asking for a mortgage all over again. But they're, to verify their assets or lack of assets. So typically, if there's a life-changing event, you lost your job, your spouse died, you're deathly ill, things like that, they would consider a short sale. But just because you don't have enough, you don't want to take that money out of your bank account, that doesn't work like that. So anyway, we'll talk about that really next month. We'll get those on the agenda. So here's our, I'm going to stay and remind, because I really kind of want to get you guys more comfortable with that platform too. I think mostly, if you know DocuSign by now, great. But I think Remind's a platform you really need to be in, because to me, it's a lot easier to maneuver through and work through and real more agent friendly. So, and even when you send the documents to the seller, it's easier to get the seller's disclosure signed, to get the lead-based paint filled out, which are challenging in DocuSign. So I'm just going to take them in order. These are in no particular order. It's just the way they're in the file. But you can maneuver these and Remind. You can move things up and down. Let's just start with a biggie. This is the exclusive right to sell. I want to make sure we dedicate enough time to this. So we'll do this first. Some of the other forms have been used, before in other classes, so we won't jump into those too deep. But this is the main ingredient. Now, this is a contract. This is signed between Keller Williams Metro and the seller, and you're the agent for that particular property. But once it's signed, it's the property of the brokerage, not the agent. That's how real estate works. So this contract is binding. It has a beginning and an end, and we will adhere to those dates as long as you tell me that's what you want to do. So there are times when that relationship goes bad. The seller wants to divorce you. The seller wants to say, I don't want to work with you anymore, and I want to end my contract. Well, that's great, but once I have a conversation with you, and I will never do that until I talk to the agent to get your side of the story, it's usually a different side of the story, right? And they're not telling me the whole story. So that gets, then we'll have a discussion on what do you want to do? Do you want to keep the listing? Do you not want to keep the listing? And sometimes it's just so damaged that they don't want to work with you. But that doesn't mean they don't want to work with anybody else in the office. So there are times when I've actually stepped in and took over the listing, and you still get paid. I'm just kind of quarterbacking it to the finish line. Same thing in a purchase agreement. Sometimes, for whatever reason, those relationships disintegrate, and then everybody's upset. So I'm always an alternative, or I can assign it to another agent if it's still like in the listing period. And like now, I wouldn't do any of that because obviously I'm not there all the time. So I would assign it to another agent that we agree on, and then you would, at a minimum, get the referral out of that. So you get something out of the deal. But once this is signed and the dates are, accurate, we're gonna try to hold to those dates, and we're not gonna. There's times I will not let a seller out of our agreement, our contract. I just won't, because our people are doing nothing wrong. They're doing. It's out on the internet. It's being marketed to 300 websites, and there are multiple photos. They've got tours. They've got Mataports. It's all dialed up, right? They're doing everything they can. They've spent money out of their pocket to get that listing up and running and to get the exposure to get to all the websites. And they're doing open houses, so they're doing all the right stuff, right? And, maybe they're receiving offers at the same time, and the seller's not cooperating with some of the feedback that comes back from those offers. So, you'll get an inspection that comes back, and now you're going to see more that the seller is going to have to react to those problems that are in an inspection. Where in the early part of this year, the seller would say, "Have a nice day. We're not fixing anything. You're taking the house yet like it is, yes or no," right? So now the seller is should be more apt to making some corrections and changes, because if they don't, they're probably going to be the same questions and the things that need to get done with the next buyer, especially if they're doing an inspection. So, what are they leveraging that somebody's not going to do an inspection? So that's the only way that they might not have to do some of those things. But as long as we see there's cooperation on the seller's part and they're willing to do those things, then we should be able to get to the finish line. But when the seller gets stubborn and says, "I'm not fixing anything," they're taking the house as is. Well, that's a problem, because if the lender flags something, that we can't move forward. So this is where it's a delicate issue, and I think it's important that you, as a listing agent, set those expectations with the seller. You need to have some flexibility. You might have somebody coming in and asking for concessions now. This wasn't done 6 months ago. Okay, it wasn't done. Nobody else was asking for concessions hardly at all. So now you might be asked to do some repairs, and especially if somebody's an FHA buyer or a VA buyer. The seller's the only one that can make those lender required repairs. The buyer can't. They don't own the house yet. You can't defer or put the money in escrow, because the lender says, "No, I'm not going to lend until they're done." So that becomes a challenge to maneuver through that. So you need to have, when you're sitting down with a seller, make sure you're explaining that. You got to have some flexibility with these things, because you never know what's going to pop up, right? And you can't be that stubborn. And that's a difficult conversation, I get, for most of you to have in the beginning of your careers. But you've got to play it out. Though. This is what's going on in the marketplace. Typical. What's our future buyer going to look like? Okay. What type of buyer do we anticipate on this house? So there's some houses that we would say are only investors. They're probably the only ones that are going to be interested in this house. Most of the other ones will be owner occupant or investors. So that's how you target. You talk about the discussions if one of those comes in another way. And, so you're preparing the seller for what you anticipate will happen once we start getting offers and showings, right? Make sure you're talking about, showings and how you want to handle that. Do you want to be okay every showing? Is it a go and show? Most sellers, when the house is occupied, they're going to want some input. They're going to want to okay each showing. Because you never know what's going on in somebody's day, if they're sick or whatever, they got babies, they got elderly people in the house. There could be restrictions for people looking and showing those homes. So have those conversations with the seller. How do how much window do you want? Do you want 2 hours, 3 hours? You want next day? It happens sometimes you do next day. That's a little challenging to maneuver through too, but usually a couple hours is fair. Somebody works on midnights. Maybe they don't want showings early in the morning because they're going to be sleeping till noon or 2 o'clock, whatever. And then only showings after that. That happens too. So, a lot of things can affect that schedule on when showings might be allowed. But you're going to set those parameters, at your listing appointment. This is, you're going to fill out the contract. This is pretty simple stuff, seller stuff here at the top. When you're filling out the form, now this date could differ from the date of the contract. So you can sign the contract ahead of time. Now, I would encourage you to do that if somebody's waffling and they're not sure if you're going to sit down And when you do this, when you do your seller consult, and you're going to sign the documents, if you do them in person, make sure you have both people there. If there's a husband and a wife, or a couple, or a partner, or whatever, make sure they're both there. Don't do it twice. Okay, you should wait until they're both available, is my recommendation. So you don't have to repeat everything all over again, too. And then you've almost got like somebody there that's witnessing what you're talking about as well. So make sure you have both the decision makers there in most cases. So typically what we will do here now in this market, I would say a minimum of 6 months would be a good number to plug in here from when the listing is going to go live. And again, this can vary. Sometimes people say, well, I still got a few more things to get done. We're not going to list till next year. But you can sit down today and fill this out and get it signed. Nothing wrong with that, but you have your start date as, let's say, January 1st, and it would expire in July. So those things you'll decide, but try to push to get at least 6 months in this market because things are taking longer to sell. And then, of course, the description, the cities, county, things like that, fill it in. Remind, again, is wonderful that it automatically puts in the legal description for you. So you've heard me before, only copy and paste the legal description from public records data or one of the data sources. Don't try to type all this. And this one's, not too complicated, but sometimes they're pretty crazy. Characters, dashes, slashes, and things like that. And if you do it wrong, it's technically not correct. So you want to make sure that you're putting the right legal description. Now, another thing that's been popping up a little bit more when it comes to my desk as the broker. Properties in particular in Detroit, when people have their home and they maybe buy the vacant lot next door to them, and then they enclose that lot with their parcel with a fence. So everything looks and smells like it's, when I put the listing up, that it's going to be this parcel. And you think it includes both parcels, but there's times when it doesn't, okay? Or you need to ask that question, it looks like there might have been another house on this parcel. Is this yours? Is it included in the sale? I mean, maybe they put the fence up illegally. I don't know, these things happen, right? So you want to make sure that whatever you're putting for sale is accurate. So if it is parcel 123 and parcel 124, then great. You have to put that in the remarks, in the additional comments. Make sure you put that in the MLS as well, that parcels that are for sale, it might be 2 parcels that are included in the actual sale. You don't have to have 2 separate listing agreements. You can roll it all into this, just put it at the end at the additional comments section. So we've been having some screw ups on this part here lately, and I don't know why. Just this weekend, somebody took the curtains for a home. We had the seller, and the seller moved out. And when they moved out, they took the curtains. Well, that's on everybody's PA, even though they're not actually physically attached to the home in most cases. They're hanging on rods, on hooks that are attached to the rods that are attached to the wall. Those things are to stay, because they're in the purchase agreement. So there was a little bit of back and forth with that, how we're going to handle it. And basically we told the seller, listen, you need to bring them back. You screwed up, you need to bring them back, or you're going to have to compensate them somehow. And the buyer had leverage because the buyer had a damage deposit. So, and it was substantial. It was like $2,500. So how much are those curtains worth to you? Is it worth tying up your deposit? Because they're going to argue and they're not going to agree, and that money's going to sit there and you're not going to get it until one of you goes to court again, right? So a good discussion to have with the sellers. Listen, we're going to put your house on the market. Is there anything here you want to take when you leave that we would consider part of the home? And that's what you're going to talk about. Your window treatments, your curtains, your rods, your light fixtures, your electronic equipment, whether it's security cameras, whether it's a Ring doorbell, whether it's a Wi-Fi thermostat. They have every right to take them, but they also have to replace them with something. You can't take a thermostat and not put something back. And the buyer coming in needs to know that when I make my offer, that these things are not included in the sale. It needs to be very clear. So that's your job as the listing agent, that you will put it in the agent remarks, and you'll make sure it also should go on the seller's disclosures, that these items are not included in the sale. So it's very clear that these are not going to be there when you do your final walkthrough. Okay, because this happens all the time. Stuff gets missing. Now we got disgruntled clients, right? And they want to argue, and then what's the value? Like even on these curtains. So she says, what's the value? What if we just pay them for the curtains? I go, well, how old are the curtains? You go, probably 10 years old. Like, so, what are they worth? $200? They're not $2,000. Of course, the buyer says, well, I can go out and buy all new ones. I go, that's not accurate. You can't. They were used. You can't replace them with new. Just like if you took a refrigerator and you weren't supposed to, what's the value of that used refrigerator, right? Maybe $2, $3, maybe no more than $500, depending on what type of fridge. But if you're going to replace it, it's $3,000, right? And the buyers was, not expecting to have that additional expense. So this gets in a little bit of tit and tat right there. So our job on the listing side is to make sure that when we sit down with the sellers, like, is there anything you want to take? Because they can't lay it on us on the end. And this is what happened here. Our agent did not have that discussion up front. You realize that. But we have to have those discussions. Are you going to take any of these things that you want to take them with you? Okay. Now's the time to talk about it. And, here's where you would list the appliances that are included and try to include the brand with the appliance. So it's, GE dishwasher, Bosch stove, Sears washer dryer, whatever. Just put the brand and the appliance, not just what kind of appliance, not just dishwasher, washer, dryer. Put the name brand, and then later on you can always follow it up with model numbers if you want. But then any exclusions would go here. So very clear, these are included and these are excluded. They're not part of the sale. Any questions on that, you guys? Because this is coming up a little bit more as the market tightens, right? And things get a little sticky. It seems like we're getting a few more disgruntlement things happened. Where people think, well, I can take that. I took less money on the house. I have every right to take that stuff with me. Well, that's not the case. Okay.
I have a question, Steve. You're listing a multifamily unit. Would you put the main address and then unit 2 or something like that? Is that the way that goes, or?
Yeah, you put somewhere when you pull it up on public records, it'll have that address. Mm-hmm. Even like in a duplex, it's one or the other. Okay. And then to play it safe in these section 25, you can write whatever you want to describe the property. So okay. If it's a anything more fourplex, six units, whatever, this is where you would put it. And then describe that all these units are included in the sale, 1 through 8. But this is only going to have one address that you're going to put on your listing agreement. Sometimes the duplex will have like 852/54 Beaconsfield. Mm-hmm. Okay, something like that. That's fair. You can put in here too, but you're only going to have one parcel ID in those cases. And you can also, and that there's not a spot for a parcel ID here. We haven't included that, but you could put that in the additional comments too. So there's no gray area. And then, yeah, we've had too often that we've had the Detroit thing with people purchase the adjacent lot for, $100, whatever they were selling them for. And people thinking that those were going to be included, and then they're not included, whatever reason, or they should have been included, and then we got problems. So when you pull up and you can see clearly it was 2 lots, there was a double wide lot, you gotta ask these questions, okay?
Is there a reason why they do it that way and they don't separate it? Or, I don't want to get too off topic. I just don't understand.
No, not really. It's just simplicity because, one parcel ID number, one address just simplifies things, right?
Okay.
It could be, like 852/64. and that would encompass the units that might have a separate address, but still within that address. So when you put it up, you got to be very descriptive in your remarks, what's included in the sale. So there's no gray area, no confusion, okay?
Okay.
All right, so go through these things. What's a fixture? So pretty much anything that's glued, screwed, bolted, and the intent was to be permanent. That's the key. What was the original intent? So issues that we've had in the past too were television wall mounts. When you have a TV mounted to the wall, what happens to the mount? In RPA, when we do a purchase agreement, we ask for them. So we felt through discussions that was the best method for the buyer, to just leave them and let the buyer deal with fixing them or taking them down at their own leisure when they paint. Because most people are going to paint when they go in. Because what we had is too many amateur repairs when people took those mounts down and they would leave it a mess. They would just throw spackle on there, or they put toothpaste on there, and it was just a mess. It was harder to clean that up than it would have been to do it from scratch if that was left behind. So that's a discussion. If you see TV mounts, do you want them or not? And we can ask for them. We can make sure they remove them. But when you say remove, you got to talk about what happens behind a wall. So when they come down, we want to make sure the seller's, patching that wall, fixing that wall somehow, or not. It's up to the buyer. If the buyer's handy, you say he'll take care of it, then great. But I've seen some horrific mounting attempts from people putting up TV mounts and doing a lousy job with multiple holes across there till they find studs. And the other one was really what we're going to add here next time I change it is decorative mirrors. So we have it in the purchase agreement, but I haven't changed this yet, to add if they're like a lot of people are doing the rehabs now, they're putting individual mirrors above the vanities. So if you got two sinks, they got two individual mirrors, not a full wall of mirror. And people were taking those when they closed because, well, it's like a picture. It's hanging on a wall. It's not meant to stay there permanently. But again, what was the intent? The intent was it was going to stay there. It's going to be over the bathroom. And then, then they take it, not put nothing back. You go back and there's nothing there. It's like, geez, oh man, what are you thinking? So these are things that I tell you that so that hopefully they never happen to you. And then you've got a problem at your walkthrough and you try to maneuver these things before you get to the closing table. And the other big one was surveillance cameras. And people think, well, the actual mount for the camera is screwed to the wall, but the camera is sitting on the mount. You can just take it right off. And it's like, no, the intent was it was going to stay there. So you don't want to get to those sticky points. If you see those in a home and the buyer wants them, you should ask for them. Make sure that they're going to be there. Don't let it be assumed. Okay. And then we had a lot of issues over my 7 years here with playscapes, with people taking them when they shouldn't have taken them, people leaving them when they should have not left them. And then people actually in one case came back and stole them after they closed, went back and stole them. Said, no, we changed our minds. We want the swing set. Well, that's not how it works. That was a phone call to the police, by the way, after that. But so again, the more and it's important, you go through these things with the seller, make sure what they want, what they don't want. And ours has been updated. Ours is a little more modern than even the GMAR one. They still have TV rotary antennas on there and things like that are kind of outdated. But anyway, just have a good, solid conversation with the seller about those. And then you're going to plug in the price, and you're going to talk to the seller about when are you going to take possession? When do you want to be able to leave that home once you close? And I'm a big fan of giving the seller at least 7 days post-closing before they have to move. Now, if everything's going smooth and it looks like it's going to close and they feel comfortable, they can give them the keys at closing. You don't have to wait the 7 days. But what we've seen happen too often is you get near the finish line and the deal falls apart. Now the seller's moved out. Now you've got a really upset seller. I thought it was going to close. You told me it was going to close. We got to clear to close and it still didn't close. And man, those are horrible to maneuver through, right? So at least if you give that seller a little buffer And 7 days is a good time. I mean, in other words, it's closed. They got their money. They're happy, and they're going to move out. Okay, that's key. So, but if they want to turn it in anytime before that, they can too. They don't have to wait 7 days. They can do it at close. They can do it in 2 days, 3 days. Doesn't matter. But at least they have that little bit of window, so they're not, dealing with moving vans coming in one day and then later on that afternoon, some more people. It's just give the seller the option. And remember, the most you can do is 60 days. 60 days post-closing is the most we can do for 2 reasons. For the mortgage companies, they will not lend for anything more than 60 days post-closing. They see that in your purchase agreement. They're going to ding it. If you do 90 days, they're going to ding it. They're going to tell you to rewrite it because the loan is a residential loan, not a commercial loan like if it was a rental property. So it's considered a rental property after 60 days. And the same thing applies to the insurance company. The insurance company will not insure that home past that 60-day window because now you're owning it, but you're not living in it. So you have to have homeowners insurance, even though you're not living on it. And then the seller now should be having renter's insurance for those 60 days. You don't want to be the one that, God forbid, you have that life event that, you have burns down, or you have some kind of tornado or some kind of damage like that, then you're wondering what you don't have the proper insurance coverage. So that's our job, is to counsel again each client with your role is going to change. You had homeowners as the seller, now you got to get renters. As the buyer coming in, you got to make sure you've got homeowners insurance. And of course, when you're getting a mortgage, the lender's going to make sure you get that, otherwise they won't lend. But give them a little extra time. Then we talk about commission. This should always be 6% unless you get some type of broker approval. So that we're getting 3% on the listing side, and we're always offering 3% on the buy side. That's our office policy. We do not discount. Once you're capped, you've got some flexibility with that, but we still should have that discussion about that. If you're going to charge less, or if you're going to take 2% on the buy side, you still got to offer 3% on the, 2% on the list side, 3% on the buy side. You can't do 2.5 and 2.5. That's not our office policy. So every now and then somebody will try to, squeak one through, and believe me, all your agents are watching that stuff, and I get the phone call and then we have a conversation about it. So just try to adhere to that. We're here to protect your money, right? There's all kind of, MLS only people out there trying to just, butcher the business with offering $600 and $700 to list a home, and, discount brokerages that are doing all kind of different. That's not us. Okay. We're really trying to protect your commissions. And then we talk about the seller. What if they refuse to sell? What happens, right? What if they're unable, due to the purchase agreement, to, go ahead and, finish off? What if it doesn't close? What happens, right? So, your contract is still in place, even though, let's say a contract doesn't close for whatever reason, it falls apart. Buyer loses their job 2 days before closing. All these stuff happens. That's what I tell them about. And then it just doesn't close. Now we got a seller that's disgruntled. The seller says, well, I want to keep the earnest money deposit. Meanwhile, the buyer lost their job. You're not going to get it. They're not qualified now. It's not like they went out and blew their ratios and, bought a sports car or bought a house full of furniture before they closed. Those things could be detrimental to them getting a denial letter. But sometimes sellers say, you know what, I changed my mind. I don't want to sell. And the bad news is, Mr. Seller and Mrs. Seller, you can be forced to sell. In Michigan, they're going to sue you for specific performance, and we can make a seller sell. And we sue all the time on this. When people say, well, I don't want to sell anymore. It doesn't happen. Okay, once that contract's signed and the buyer's still on board, the buyer can sue. They'll hire an attorney, they'll sue you, and you will have to move. You can't stay. Now, on the other hand, you can't make a buyer buy. It's kind of weird, right? But you can't make a buyer buy. The buyer's got 2 penalties. They can lose their earnest money deposit, and they could be sued for the differential in the sale price. Let's say and this just happened. Buyer says, I'm no longer interested in that property. I'm out. Well, that's great, Mr. Buyer. We're going to keep your earnest money deposit. And okay. And depending on what this house now sells for, again, we could potentially sue you for the difference. And that happened. So we had $1 million property that was, and exactly what happened, where the buyer changed their mind and came up with cockamamie excuses not to close. Like, oh, well, the carpets were soiled more than they were when I made my offer. And then there's this leak underneath the sink. Meanwhile, they waived their inspection. So when you waive your inspection, you waive all your options as far as talking about condition, because they never established condition through the inspection. So meanwhile, we've got some sellers that are extremely upset, right? So the next deal those sellers get comes in $100,000 less. So what do you think those sellers are going to try to do? They're going to sue those buyers for the difference, and they might prevail. I don't know. It could be, but they've talked to an attorney. They're going to try to pursue it, but that's a big number. And just because I know you backed out for not a good reason, doesn't mean you're going to get your money back, and doesn't mean there isn't additional penalties. So those are the two things that can happen to a buyer. They can forfeit their earnest money, and they potentially could be sued for the differential from your contract to what it finally sells for with another contract. Any questions on that? That's a little confusing sometimes. Doesn't happen often, but it's out there. Forcing the seller to sell happens more than you want to know. And then we get sellers like, get another offer or privately while you're under contract, and they want to kick you to the curb. They want to kill your deal. That's not going to happen. You got a signed, executed contract. That's golden. And we're going to try to make that work to protect our clients. So read over this stuff with the seller. These are the different options, what can happen. The other thing is, once you're under contract, and we had this happen enough where we modified this listing agreement, that prior to the expiration, let's say you're out, you had an open house, and people, somehow the seller and the buyer ran into each other, or a potential buyer. And the seller says to that future buyer, maybe like, hey, my contract's due to expire in a week. Why don't you come back in a week and we can sell this house. I can save you some money. I don't have to pay any commissions, and everybody's happy. Well, in our agreement, if we are presented with an offer while we're still under contract, the seller must negotiate that offer in good faith. Because we had people that would send that offer with 3 or 4 days left, and then they go MIA, missing in action. They're not responding to anybody. They're going to well, I don't have to respond. And that's another quirk of Michigan, is the seller never has to respond to an offer, which to me is weird. But that's what it is. In Michigan, you do not have to respond to an offer, as crazy as that is. So the seller says, I don't have to give him a counter. I don't want a counter. I don't want to talk to anybody, and waits till that listing agreement expires. Now they think they're free to go ahead and make their deal with that person on the side. Well, that's not the case. So we want to get that contract in as soon as we can, and we want to negotiate in good faith and get the seller their proceeds, right? So that happened enough when we modified the contract, believe me. So nobody else is going to have that in their listing agreement, because it happened. And I talked to the attorney. I'm like, John, what can we do about this? I go, this is the third time this has happened under my watch, and I don't want it to happen again, where the seller just stopped talking to us, right? And they already had an offer in hand. And then what really makes you mad is then you find out that that offer came back and offered again, and they closed with that offer. That very upsetting. Each listing agreement will have a compliance fee, and we do offer different structures: $295, $395, $495, and there's some teams that even have more than that. But you as an individual agent, a couple things you have to consider. I still use 295. I think many of us do, but you can use more, but you need to be consistent. You can't waffle. You can't charge somebody 295 and then somebody else 395, somebody else 495, because it could be an indirect form of discrimination, depending on who those people are, their nationalities, their race, and so forth. So be careful. Just be consistent is the key. We do allow you that flex here in this office, so you can charge different compliance fees. But when you're new, stick to the low one. Okay. When you get a little more experience, you got a database, you got consistent paychecks, you can bump it up at that point. But that's my advice. Keeping it. This is hard enough to explain and get everybody on board. It's like, wait a minute, I'm paying you 6%, and I got to pay you $300 more for this, for what? So it tells you what it's for here, right? But you got to hoop it up a little bit more than that. Some people say, well, I'm not paying it. And I'm going to tell you, anytime you get an attorney involved to read the docs, the attorney's going to knock that out. Guaranteed. So when that happens to you, then you'll remember me. Guaranteed they're going to knock that out. Oh, you can't, we're not going to pay that. Meanwhile,
what is it for?
They're going to bill them. They're going to bill them $500 for the hour that they just spent with them. Okay. Andre, I muted you. All right.
Hey, Steve, quick question.
Yeah.
And I want to say it's either DocuSign. It's probably DocuSign. The 395 form is not available for city.
Okay. Yeah, we didn't go crazy with city out of the gate because it's a lot of work to do all those in the forms, So 395, the listing agreement.
Yes.
Okay. All right. We'll work on that. All right. Next one we got default. So this is like when a deal falls apart and the buyer's going to forfeit their EMD. So this gives us an option to potentially get part of that deposit, because sometimes when you get to this point, you're divorcing. They don't like you anymore. They're not going to relist with you. They don't want you to handle the property anymore. And if you put like 50% in there, at least you're going to get something as part of the settlement to basically terminate that agreement, right? So what I typically do is friends and family, I put a 0. I'm not going to charge them, or I'm not going to get any money out of them. But if there's somebody I don't know, I'm putting 50%. And you still have the option to not take that, right? If you know you're going to get the listing, I don't think you're going to beat them up for the 50%. You want to keep that seller happy. You want to keep them engaged. They're going to keep the listing with you. I would forfeit that. And you can tell them that. So now you look like a hero. So, you know what, originally I was supposed to get half of that earnest money deposit, but as long as you continue to list with me, and we're going to extend the listing at this point, you make sure you extend the listing. Don't give yourself like 30 days. Give yourself a little more time. And then I'd be happy that I want you to get that deposit. And we give you that flex. You can do that. Anytime you try to purchase with an option, we're going to get paid. Yeah, consideration negotiation, consideration form. All right, generalities, multi-list. So this is where we put the co-oping agents commission, future commission, and we need to explain that to the seller. Sellers don't get it sometimes. They think we're going to get the whole 6%. So listen, we're going to, I would love that would happen more often, but the reality is we typically will have a co-oping agent, an agent from another brokerage, in fact, on the other side of the transaction. So how does that work, right? So, we sign a listing agreement for 6%. 3% will be for the listing side broker. 3% will be for the buyer side broker. And you should always use the word broker, not agent, so that they understand there's another layer to that, right? So even the 3%, you have to understand, Mr. Seller, that even if it says 3%, I'm only going to get a portion of that because I have to split my commission with my broker. Feel free to tell them that. You don't have to tell them exactly what your splits are. Even if you're capped, I'm going to tell them I'm going to split it. I'm going to stretch that out a little bit because everybody thinks you're going to make all this money. That's no other business if you're capped or not. It shouldn't affect what you're offering as compensation. So typically, we're going to have a 3% in there. And listen, if you're negotiating against somebody else to get the listing, and the seller comes back and says, you know what, are you flexible now? We've got somebody else that's offering to do it cheaper. You're going to come back and have that discussion with me. Okay, we do have some flex there. We will allow you to change that with broker permission or team leader permission. You're talking to Justin. We'll allow you to make those changes. We want you to get the listing, number one. Okay, but we're not going to do it for nothing. Okay, and we're not an MLS only. We don't do just put it in the MLS. That's not our office. We don't do that. So again, we're explaining that we're going to split our commission with another broker. And you can say, if it's somebody in my office, it's treated like it's still another broker. So if Cheryl and I do a deal on it, we're both going to get 3%. I'm not going to change that percentage, even though the office is getting a portion of each, potentially. You're going to ask the seller, is there anything that would prohibit us having a clear marketable title to convey to the buyer? Now, is there anything that might be a title obstruction? Or is there any easements? Are there any boundary disputes, potentially any liens that might be on the house from every previous work that might have been completed? Anything that might prohibit the ability to convey a clear title to the buyer. And the other couple of things we talk about is, we ask them if there's a mortgage. Is there a mortgage? That should trigger another document at that point. We're going to need a mortgage payoff. Agencies, in case we do a deal with another agent in our office, we are what we call a designated brokerage. So I can work with Cheryl, I can work with Charlie on any transaction. We don't have to do any additional paperwork. We're already telling the clients on the buy side and on the listing side that we are a designated broker. So we can work with agents within our office. And Mr. Buyer and Mr. Seller, this is how it works. We don't have to sign. We're putting them on notice in each of our contracts in the PA and here that this could be an option. So it's not a surprise. We don't have to be dual agents. Everybody gets mixed up with what is a dual agent. So that's not a dual agent. Okay, we're two separate agents working on the same transaction. Very rare are you ever going to be a dual agent in real estate in a designated brokerage. So then for showings and signs, we say, how do you want to do the showings? How much notice do you want? How do you want to be notified? Text, email, or phone call. Okay, what's your preference? Don't go against that preference. Don't do, we had somebody say, I don't want any texts. And it was a younger agent that did a lot of texting, and it was very hard for them not to text. And they kept texting the client. And the client, after less than a week, said, what don't you understand? I don't want any text. I want you to call me. It was a little more old school. And we terminated the agreement because it was just not going to work for those particular, try to assign them to another agent. But so something that simple can make that blow up, right? Respect what your clients, how they want to be notified. For sale signs are critical to our business. People still drive neighborhoods. People still look at for sale signs, and decide to call or not see that house or put it on their potential wish list. So it's important that we have for sale signs out in the yards. Some areas are not conducive to that. A little more high crime theft areas where they might steal the sign. This unfortunate, but it does happen. We try to push that. Lock boxes, we have discussions about lock boxes. So we have the electronic lock box. So when a property is occupied, I highly suggest that we use a central lock. I use central locks on everything. I think they're great. There are a lot less, obviously you cannot give out that code to a buyer. And this is what's happened with, it was almost epidemic during the foreclosure era, where buyer agents were just giving lockbox codes to buyers and telling them to go look at the property. Well, that's a violation of the code of ethics. Plus, it's finable by the Realcom. It's $1,000 fine if they get busted, and they will get busted because in those things, there's people coming in all the time to look at and examine those houses to make sure condition hasn't changed, right? They're field service people. So with electronic lockbox, you can't get in unless you're a licensed agent and you have the app, and now you got to have even a password or passcode on there too when you're punching in to go use a central lock. So, and when that person opens the box, you get dinged with an email. I think that's the greatest thing on the planet. So you know that somebody actually opened the lockbox, and ideally at that point they went in, unless you got security cameras to see that. But try to utilize those. We have a shortage in our office. Agents are very stingy with giving them back to me. I only have a couple in the supply line, so I'm constantly asking for them. And if you're not using them, then get rid of them because they're $120. If you lose them, you're going to be responsible. Once they're assigned to you, if you lose them, even if it's through theft, potentially you're going to have to pay that money. So those, again, it gets a little expensive, but it really gives to me, it gives the homeowner a little more peace of mind when you use those kind of lock boxes, because if you're not using those, and you can use the old ones, they work great. We did it for many years, obviously, but a couple of key things you got to do on the old ones. Don't use the same code on every house. Okay. A lot of agents like, oh, I like, 456, or it's typically it's a 4-digit code. And they use that on every house. So I know that if I go to look at one of Cheryl's listings, she uses 456 on every listing. Well, after a while, it doesn't take, I can remember that and go say, well, I don't need to have a schedule. I can go see Cheryl's house and just open up the code, take the key and go back in. But you never know I went in, right? Because it was the old style lock boxes. So a couple key things on the old style lock boxes is once you're under contract, change the code. But you go pending, okay? Once the inspection is done, change the code. Once the appraiser is done, change the code. And you never have those issues of people going in unauthorized. Part of the drawback with the Sentry lock is we've had houses next door to each other. And the agent was supposed to show the house on the left, but by mistake, they went into the house on the right, and that had a central lock. And they just, opened it up, typical. And it wasn't scheduled, so it allowed them to open it even though it wasn't scheduled. And how would you like to be that homeowner and somebody walking in on you, who knows doing what? And luckily they didn't get shot too, right? You never know what somebody's on the other side doing or has. So double check when you're showing houses too, that you got the right address, because that's happened a few times where people went into the wrong house. And just because it has a central lock doesn't mean you have permission to go in there. You must schedule it on the MLS. You have to be okay to go in. You cannot just go in anytime. You have to have permission.
Steve,
Yeah.
I thought it was attached to the listing, so the right house has to appear when you're going in Country Lock, right? No?
No.
Oh,
So they're working on that.
okay,
Yeah, it should be assigned to the property,
right.
but it's not sophisticated enough to say that you didn't. They don't know that you didn't schedule it.
Okay.
Okay. You can restrict the time that somebody can go in. Like if you're going to do a showing,
Mhm.
you can do a half hour before and a half hour after, so you give some flex. You can't go 2 hours early.
Oh, okay.
You're going to restrict that, but you call Central Lock and Real Comp and they can do that for you. I'm not a big fan of that. Have some flex, but again,
Right.
you know when somebody goes in when they open that box, which I think is huge.
Mhm.
Make sure you're talking about firearms, jewelry, and medications. If you got that stuff, keep them secure, get them out of the house in a lot of cases, give them to your kids, give them to your relative or whatever, put them in your car. Don't leave them laying around. People leave money laying around, jewelry laying around, their medicine cabinets full of, if you've got opioids in there, they're going to get stolen. They will. So make sure they're securing all that stuff. If there's electronic surveillance, we need to know about it. Okay. No secret tape recording of anybody everybody has what we call a reasonable expectation for privacy. Even though you're in somebody else's home, okay? The expectation is I'm not being filmed. So if they're filming, or if they're, there's video and audio, you cannot audio record without someone's permission. That's why when you're on the phone and they always ask you, is this okay if we take this, for whatever? They usually ask you. So if they're doing both, like a video doorbell is both. You can hear voices. My security cameras, I can hear voices outside from my cameras, right? So I need to let people know that that's happening. So you can put it in the agent remarks that the property is under audio and video surveillance, okay? Winterizations, now we're in a critical time with temperatures dipping below freezing. We have to have a discussion if the property is going to be vacant. Do you want it winterized, yes or no? And people say, oh no, the furnace is working great, everything's fine, I never had any problems. Well, as soon as that happens, then you get a snowfall or you get a winter storm and the power's knocked out and you're out for a week. Now what happens? So, who's going to check on the house? Is it your responsibility to check on the house when it's vacant? To a certain extent, yes. You should probably go at least once a week. But typically, you might want to go after each showing, knowing how some agents are always bad with securing homes, turning lights off, monkeying with a thermostat, things like that. So that's a good practice to go, at the end of each day, if you have showings, go check the house, make sure it's secure. It's one extra step. Your sellers will greatly appreciate that. But all bank-owned properties, HUD homes, are all winterized. As soon as they get them, they don't take a chance. They'll drop the hot water tank, empty it out. They'll drop the meter, actually remove it and put it on the ground. They'll blow out all the lines, so they'll try to minimize any potential damage. If the heat went out, many times they're not even a furnace on, like in a HUD, all those things are off. Nothing's on. So now the buyer has to turn those things on to do their inspection. So that gets a little daunting. It's a little expensive to winterize too, but it's a lot cheaper than having your pipes broken and then having to have an insurance claim. Well, and septic sounds like a simple answer. There are times when sellers don't know. And if they don't know, you need to go to the county and municipality to find out what's going on there. Is it a septic? Yes or no? That also is on the seller's disclosure question. How we're going to market the property and referrals, what happens. Remember, if somebody knocks on their door, why it's listed, you got a for sale sign in the yard, make sure you tell the seller, don't open the door. Don't let them in. You don't know who in the hell that is. So typically when there's a showing, it's scheduled through an agent who's certified and they've already scrubbed the buyer, ideally, right? Are you a U.S. citizen? Simple yes or no. Again, generic kind of stuff here. I'm not going to read all that. And we talk about home warranty. So as the market gets tighter, we're going to be offering more home warranties out there. So have that discussion. It's a great thing. It covers the seller, why it's in the listing period. This is huge. So that we put the property up, we're on the market, and let's say my hot water tank craps out is the best example. The bottom rusts out. It's been, it's 15 years old. You don't get a new one, but there will be some relief from the home warranty company. They'll give them $200-300 probably towards the purchase of a new one. And, with our guy, you can pick your own contractor. So you got friends or family that are one of those trades, you can use them. So have that discussion about the home warranty. It's good to talk about it. And you can use that sometimes when you're having issues with inspections. You can offer that to the buyer that will cover that with a home warranty. Now, these are $500 now. They've gone up. And to cover, most of the appliance, sometimes you got to add additional coverage, like, for additional air conditioner, additional appliances, things like that. So review that. We have the booklets in the office, review that, but it's the best company out there for this home warranty stuff. And you get everything signed. All right, any questions on the exclusive right to sell? All right, so anytime you have a change in the listing, if you want to take the listing down for a weekend because they're going to have people over, they're going to have a party, we're going to get to that one. they still need to do some work. They're getting feedback from their showings. And so we're going to go ahead and paint these couple of rooms. We'll take the house off the market. This is the form you use. If you're going to release a listing, okay, you're going to use this form. So unconditional means we're making a significant change, whether we're going to release it, we're done. And if you're releasing while you're still under a listing agreement, be careful. Okay, we try to keep the listing in home if we can, in house. So if you have a disgruntled seller, and maybe it's a conversation I might have with that seller to try to salvage the transaction. So if releasing is that when we do that unconditionally released, it's gone. It's fair game. It's open to everybody. They will get pounded by Keller Williams agent the next day, asking them if they want to relist. If you're going to relist, Real Comp gives you at least 2 days to relist the same property. So I want to take it down. We're going to make a price change. It's always a good time to take it down. Refresh it with a new listing. You get a new MLS number. The days on market do not reset. Okay, they only reset if you've been off the market unconditionally for 31 days or more. Even if you conditionally withdraw, in other words, I'm going to take it off for a little amount of time for whatever reason. I don't need this if you're changing the price or extend it, but I'm the one in the office that would do either one of these through the MLS. I'm the only one. Okay, so you need to have it signed by the seller with permission. I won't sign it until the seller signs it, and I won't take it out until I see the seller signed it, so that we're all in agreement. Okay, so any of this other stuff that you can do, if you had it for sale and for lease, and we were closing it out, let's say you didn't sell it, but you leased it, then we would check this box that it was sold or closed, and it really closed under another MLS because you had 2 listings at that point. So I try to have one of these signed already by the seller, so I've got one ready to go, and fill it in as best you can. Listing number is important, so when I'm looking at those, I want to make sure I match up. Make sure you're not using an old listing number. People get confused. I'll send you back a little email or text, like just making sure what you want me to do here, because I think maybe conditional is what you want to do, but you checked unconditional. And so anyway, make sure those things are signed by the seller. Agency agreement, no matter what we're doing, you're using one of these. Who are we working for? Buyer, seller, landlord, tenant. We have the what to submit form. So if you're don't remember, these are great forms to have handy. So if you got the seller, these are the forms we're going to use. And now, in lieu of the listing Real Comp form, you can also have a signed MLS. But it's important you have either or, because it'll have the features of the home. So to make sure that we didn't screw up or didn't include something on there, or included something that we shouldn't have included. And also it verifies the co-op commission, so that the seller's seeing that we are offering 3% to the buy side on the MLS ticket or on the listing form. That's why we use either one of those. It's those 2 reasons. So this is the form you would use when you're putting up a listing. This asks all the questions about the property. Does it have air conditioning? Does it got a humidifier? Does it have an air cleaner? Is it on a cul-de-sac? Is it a paved street, private street? So you would go through and answer all these questions. This is the remind portion. It's a lengthy document. It's 16 pages. So if you can, you send this to the seller ahead of time and let them fill out the feature portion of the contract. So here, this agreement. So they can fill these little things. This saves a lot of time at your listing appointment. It saves you almost a half hour. But by the time you walk around and look at all this stuff, it's going to take you a half hour probably. So try to send this to the seller ahead of time, have them fill it out to the best of their knowledge, and you can finish it out together. Same thing with the seller's disclosure statement. The only thing you guys should have on here is a fingerprint in the right-hand corner if you're right-handed, or a fingerprint in the left-hand corner if you're left-handed, and you're handing it over to the client. You do not touch this document. You do not fill out this document. You can answer questions, okay? They say, well, how should I, make sure every line has a check mark. Okay, don't misalign me, double check that. And part of your job is when you get it back is to double check that every line. And the answer is, when the answer here says range, dishwasher, refrigerator, if you're checking yes here, okay, that means only that they're working. It doesn't mean they're included in the sale, and it's right here. The items below are in working order. Items below are included in the sale only if on the purchase agreement so provides. So this is only telling us that they're working. So if I had a dishwasher that wasn't working, but it's in the house, I'm going to tell you that up front. It's there. We're not going to fix it for whatever reason, which would not probably a good move in today's market. But anyway, you would check no. And if you don't know, you're going to check unknown. Or if it's not available, it's not going to go with you. It's almost like an exclusion. Then you would check here. So each one of these lines, and some of these are a little antiquated. This document needs to be revised and get more modern, but it is what it is. We've been using the same thing for over 20 years, literally. And read these sections. Imperative, you read these with the client so they understand each provision in here. This is critical. This is the most abused document in real estate. And people either don't fill it out correctly or refuse to fill it out correctly. And the instructions are very clear. It says answer all questions. So if you scribble on here, I never lived in the property, you didn't answer all the questions, right? So I'll kick it back when I see that happen. I say, well, can you please fill this out? We need to let the buyer know, are these items included, yes or no? Are they in working order? And if they still refuse, that's fine. But when that happens, then you really got to tell the buyer, listen, you got to do a really thorough inspection because we're not getting any help from the seller. They're not telling us anything about that house. So I've had sellers check all unknown and sign it, and it's legal. I've had sellers scribble across the whole thing, never lived in it, and sign it, and it's legal, unfortunately. But if they do that and they don't sign the document, and they should sign and date always, but it doesn't have a spot here, weird, for a date. So that's how I would revise this document. So when you're setting this to the seller, make sure you have a spot for them to sign and import the date field if it's not there. You can import it. So we know the date that this was filled out by the seller. Critical information here. Talk to the buyer when the buyer sees this, that the value of the property or the principal residential could change and probably will change with the sale. Your taxes are going to change with the sale. So this is in our PA as well. Almost the same verbiage, just tweaked a little bit. So that we're putting the buyer in two spots on notice that your payment's probably going to be, based on whether it's principal residential residence or not. Are you homesteaded? And it's not going to be what the current seller's paying. It's going to change. And if that seller's lived there for a long time, they're going to change dramatically. So those things, they should be getting counseled by their lender as well. Our job is just to let them know that if you're serious and you want to know more details on this, you should call the assessor's office and find out what your future tax bill is going to be, because I don't want you giving that information. I just want you to pointing them in the right direction. That's our job a lot of times. Just point them in the right direction so they can get the answers themselves. Many agents want to just jump in and make it like they're the top agent in the world and they get them all this information. Well, if you screw that up, we got a big problem. So that's why I said, let's just guide them there. Talk to an attorney, talk to the assessor, talk to the appraiser, talk to the inspector. That's our job, is just point them in the right direction and give them enough tools to, do what they need to do. If you're worried about school systems, don't you give that information. Tell them there's plenty of resources online. If you're worried about crime statistics, sexual offender lists, all those things are available online. Don't be the one that gives it, because if you do it wrong, then you're going to get sued and then we're going to get sued. So it's critical. You go through this document, give yourself, in fact, the best thing to do is, and I do, is I send this to the seller along with the real comp sheet the day before. Say, please fill this out to the best of your knowledge, and then we'll go over it. But the instructions are, make sure every line has a check mark. So everybody can do that. Should be no problem with checking each line. And if you're unsure of any of these other things, just wait and we'll go over them in person. I'll be happy to talk about them. But a couple of key things here, where a lot of people screw up, is the one question. Number one, has there been evidence of water? And there's a couple of words that are missing here. You should approach this as there ever been evidence of water. And then it's like, why you owned it. It doesn't matter what happened before that was on that seller's disclosures when you bought the house, but it's why you've owned this home. Has there ever been evidence of water in the basement? It's a simple yes or no. And that means if it leaked from the kitchen into the basement, that's the water in the basement. If it came up from the sewer, if it came up from the sub pump, if it came out from the walls or a crack in the wall or a rod hole in the wall, that's a yes. Okay, talk about it, explain it. If you can't fit it in, add an additional third page and make sure you're noting that there's a third page. That'll be part of your attachment. It's critical you explain what happened, because inevitably, when they're going to go get their insurance, if there's been a previous claim, it'll show up. So you can't weasel this stuff unless somebody paid cash and they were, dumb enough not to get insurance. So talk about this. And the best thing is to be honest and forthwith. Don't try to hide or lie about this stuff. And you can't be a part of any of that. You can't even have knowledge of that stuff. If somebody's not telling you the truth, then hopefully they're not telling you the whole story. But this is critical. And sometimes I feel that the best answer is yes. And then let the buyer figure out what's going on. And this at least gives them the opportunity to check those areas. Like, we had water in the northwest corner of the basement, and that was as simple as maybe the downspout wasn't extended far enough out from the house. It was going right down, or some of the older homes, they went right into a crack pipe. Well, over time that shifts and cracks. So that's going to affect your basement. I mean, water's going to find a way in. So that's probably one of the questions that gets screwed up the most. The other one is over here on the last page is number 4. Any structural modifications, alterations, or repairs made without necessary permits or licensed contractors. So that means it says, basically it should say any. Again, it's missing a word. But anything that's been done to that home, did you use licensed contractors or not? So just tell the truth. People are flipping houses today and not pulling permits. Okay, that's their option. But you as a buyer, you should know that up front. And if you can see that some work's been done, obviously they're putting a whole new kitchen in, new bathrooms, and basement's finished. Somebody did the work, right? Were they licensed or not? You should know that. Because if they weren't, you're going to do a much tougher inspection. And if they didn't pull permits, you need to know now, because what's happening is the city can come back, and who's ever owning that home at the time, they could make you pull the permits and get them inspected for the work that was performed, even though you had no part of that. So that's a critical thing. And in our purchase agreement, we have what we call the Eagle Advantage policy, title policy, which gives some relief to the buyer in the event one of these issues that happened from the previous seller and now the buyer's being called up about it. So that's why that's in there. It costs the seller more money, but it gives the buyer additional coverage or protections. So again, it's a simple yes or no here, or many times this page is unknowns. People don't know, but if you pulled permits or not. I mean, this is critical. So I had one of my agents that did a flip, and she used her relatives and friends to do the work. So I said, well, just check no. Just say the truth. Don't say that you use licensed contractors, because you definitely didn't pull permits, right? And some of the cities are lax on this. Some are on the ball. Some, any kind of pre-sale inspections and stuff, they're making all that stuff being done correctly. So have some discussion about this. Make sure they fill it out. Again, it says answer all the questions. Okay, it doesn't say just scribble on there. And you can kick it back. and see if they'll fill it out. If they refuse, then they refuse. But here's a critical thing, and you all should know that if this seller's disclosure is not signed, okay, at any point prior to closing, the buyer can back out of the transaction. Any point. Not everybody knows that. So it's in here. We do have exceptions to the seller's disclosure. So there are 9 major categories, and ours I put a 10th. That if you were one of these, you don't need to fill out a seller's disclosures. Pretty simple stuff, just read it. You would include this, not the other one we just went over. Lead-based paint, we have 2 primary lead-based paints. One if it's built before 78, one if it's built after 78, but you will always have a lead-based paint on anything you ever do in this office. Landlord, tenant, buy, sell. Just get in the habit of always including it. If it's not included as part of the lease listing or the for sale listing, then you generate the document. That's fine. It doesn't have to come from the listing side if they haven't done it. All bank-owned, all HUDs will have a lead base somewhere in their contract. They will not have a seller's disclosures. Banks are exempt. Your title companies will have an affiliation, an ABA, affiliated business agreement, so that some of them, Legacy will require it, that everybody acknowledges that they understand that Keller Williams Metro and Legacy are in a partnership of some type, and you could benefit from that relationship. Just putting the seller on notice. The payoff authorization, we put it right in this form set. So you start the discussion right away at your listing appointment. Have them go pull the info, because sometimes when they could buy and sell a mortgage, a couple times during the course of a year. Make sure they have the current information, and they'll need a signed authorization. When you're doing social security numbers, just put the last 4, and the title company will communicate with the seller to get the complete social security number. Do not send that over the internet. So this authorizes the payoff, and don't wait to the last minute, because it'll delay your closing. Some of the mortgage companies are horrible at getting this out in a timely fashion. Homeowners insurance, homeowners association. Sometimes it's hard to tell if there's an association. Like the house I sold here in Troy, we had an association when we first built the house 30 some years ago, but it really fizzled, and it had no power. It had nobody really paying attention to it. So there really wasn't an association when we sold it. It had this pretty much disbanded and wasn't enforcing any of the original things that were in there. But have the discussion. If there is, get that contact info, because the future buyer is going to want to know that. Have the seller provide that. Showing instructions, again, have those conversations with the seller. How do you want to be shown? How much notice do you want? You're going to get cell phones, you're going to get email addresses. In what order do you want to be notified? Critical you talk about this and leave enough time so that everybody's comfortable with the ability to get the house ready. I always tell the seller, listen, when you leave the house in the morning, if you're going to work, it should be in ready to show condition. Not that you have to run back and change the sheets or fix the sheets or put away the dishes. For us, you got to be vigilant. You got to be on the ball to get this stuff ready for showings and look nice. Another little key, nice thing to do is have your seller pick the 4-digit code for your lockbox if you're using a different old-fashioned lockbox, so that they have it. They can always open and take the key out. If they're like, some people like I like to do that at night. If before we had these electronics, I would take it out at night so that a lot of people get that lockbox code. If you got a hot listing and it's been shown 30 times, that's why I tell you to rotate your codes. And I wish everybody was honest, but they're not. So these are some of the things that can save you a very uncomfortable situation if you rotate your codes. And don't use the same code on every house. Closing insurance. So we talk about who gets what insurance. We had discussed that a little earlier. with, now the seller becomes the tenant if they're staying post-closing. And the buyer, of course, will have homeowners insurance. So this is just an acknowledgement that we've talked about it, because people say, well, you never told me that. I didn't know that. Serious? So anyway, more paperwork. We've made an addendum. Here, next we've got the affiliated business agreement that shows some of our preferred vendors, title, the 3 lenders that we have. This has changed now. He has a different name. And the insurance company and mortgage, home warranty. So these fees are accurate. Are you using them? Yes or no? Pretty simple. Required form. We do have COVID addendum in there. Right now it's not required, but you should go over it so they understand protocol. You're gonna have people coming in here as strangers. You don't really know if they have COVID or they don't have COVID, or they got the flu or not have the flu. So what would you like? You're gonna see in today's news, there was, some of the East Coast, in particular big cities, look like they might be doing the mask mandate again, not optional. So the way things are going with some of the numbers, that might be what's going to be happening for this winter again, where this would come into play. But right now it's not mandatory, but you should have the discussion about the risks that are involved. And the fraud, from the seller's end is not as prevalent, of course, but it could affect their transaction. So you need to have the discussion with, this is typically what happens. The buyer will get those instructions from hopefully the proper entity and received in the correct fashion their instructions. But there are times when we have, unfortunately, fraud that takes place. So that would affect the ability to close. When the seller receives their fund, it usually comes right from the title company and will go into their account. That I've never seen be part of fraud. It's usually when the buyer is sending those funds out to the title company that the fraudsters come in and impersonate a broker, impersonate a title company, and give them misinformation to send them to a fraudulent account. So I had the discussion so they're aware that this is prevalent in today's world, and it could affect our ability to close. So everybody's doing their best to avoid these situations, obviously, but this is just putting the seller on notice that, hey, this is out there, it's real. And then we have the lead-based paint booklet. So any house that's built before 78, this is something that should be attached to your listing. So you'll have your seller's disclosures, lead-based paint, and then add the booklet too. It's good practice to get into, to have that as part of your listing as an attachment. And that's it. I think we covered them all in miraculous fashion. It's a little after 3. Any questions? A couple of you hang in there. All right, guys, have a great day. Thanks for stopping in. We'll see you Wednesday.
Thanks, Steve.
All right,
Thanks,
take
Steve.
care.
Have a
All right, see you.